Everyone knows Titanic, the iceberg, the broken ship, the lifeboats, the freezing Atlantic. Roughly 1,500 people died, and more than a century later, the disaster is still one of the most famous tragedies on Earth. But 33 years after Titanic, another ship went down in freezing water. This time, the death toll was not 1,500. It was more than 9,000 by the most widely cited estimates. And yet, if you ask most people to name the ship, they will have no idea. Its name was Wilhelm Gustloff. And the reason you may never have heard of it begins with where it was, who was on board, and what was happening around it. January 1945. Nazi Germany is collapsing. The Red Army is driving west, and huge numbers of civilians are fleeing from East Prussia. Roads are clogged. Transport is overwhelmed. Winter turns every journey into a gamble. For thousands of people, the Baltic Sea looks like the last way out. Germany begins a massive evacuation by sea. Ships of every kind are used to carry troops and civilians westward. One of them is Wilhelm Gustloff. Years earlier, the ship had been built as a cruise liner for Nazi Germany's Strength Through Joy program. Before the war, it carried vacationers. During the war, its role changed. It served for a time as a hospital ship and later as accommodation for German naval personnel. Now its job is evacuation. On January 30th, 1945, people crowd into the port of Gotenhafen, today Gdynia, Poland. The Gustloff had originally been designed for far fewer passengers than the mass now trying to board. Children, mothers, elderly refugees, wounded people, naval personnel, military passengers. They fill cabins, corridors, public rooms, almost every available space. The passenger list cannot fully keep up. No one today can say with complete certainty exactly how many people were aboard, but estimates exceed 10,000. Now imagine standing inside that ship. There is barely room to move. Luggage is under your feet. Families are trying not to lose one another in the crowd. Outside, the Baltic winter is brutally cold, but the ship is finally moving west. And for many people aboard, that alone feels like salvation. Then, beneath the surface, another vessel enters the story. The Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko, is patrolling the Baltic. That evening, its crew spots the large German ship. And here the story becomes more complicated. The Gustloff is not simply a civilian passenger liner. It is a German wartime transport carrying huge numbers of refugees, but also German military personnel. It is not sailing as a protected Red Cross hospital ship. To the submarine crew, it is an enemy vessel. S-13 begins to maneuver into position. Inside the Gustloff, thousands of people have no idea that a submarine is tracking them through the darkness. For a few more minutes, the ship is simply moving west. Then, Marinesko gives the order. The torpedoes are fired. 4 leave S-13, 3 hit the Gustloff. The first moments are confusion. Then they become terror. Explosions tear through sections of the vessel. Water begins entering the ship. People packed into the interior suddenly try to reach the upper decks at the same time. And now the enormous number of people aboard becomes part of the disaster. Stairways choke. Corridors become bottlenecks. Families that had stayed together through days of escape are separated in seconds. Some routes upward become almost impossible. And outside, the cold has created another problem. Some lifeboats are difficult to launch in the freezing conditions. There are nowhere near enough easy paths to safety for everyone aboard. The ship begins to list. Now imagine finally reaching the open deck. The air hits your face. The deck beneath your feet is tilting. People are pushing toward anything that looks like an escape route. Parents are searching for children. Crew members are trying to launch boats. And beyond the rail is black Baltic water, cold enough to kill quickly. Some people make it into lifeboats. Some jump. Some are thrown into the water. Others never reach the deck. And all of this is happening incredibly fast. Wilhelm Gustloff sinks in less than an hour. Rescue vessels arrive and pull survivors from boats and from the freezing sea. But they can save only a fraction of the people who had sailed. Around 1,200 survivors were recovered, according to one major historical account. The exact number of dead remains uncertain, because the exact number aboard was uncertain. Different reconstructions produce different totals, but estimates reach roughly 9,000 or more, several times the death toll of Titanic. And this brings us back to the question from the beginning. If this disaster was so much larger, why does almost everyone know Titanic, while millions have never even heard the name Wilhelm Gustloff? Because history does not remember tragedies by numbers alone. Titanic sank in peacetime. Its story can be isolated into one extraordinary night, a famous luxury liner, an iceberg, too few lifeboats, passengers trapped between wealth, class, chance, and time, a ship everyone believed was extraordinarily safe disappearing beneath the Atlantic. It became a story the world could understand almost instantly. Wilhelm Gustloff was different. It sank inside something incomparably larger. The Second World War was approaching its end in Europe. Nazi Germany had launched a war of conquest and genocide that had devastated the continent and murdered millions. At the same moment German civilians were fleeing west, the world was confronting the enormous crimes committed by the Nazi regime. That made the Gustloff difficult to fit into a simple story of innocent victims and obvious villains. The people dying aboard included huge numbers of civilians. They included children. They also included German military personnel. The submarine that sank them belonged to the Soviet Union, a country that had itself suffered catastrophic destruction and loss under Nazi Germany's invasion. None of those facts erases another. They make the story more difficult. And difficult stories are often remembered differently from simple ones. There is another reason. The Nazi regime had little interest in broadcasting a catastrophe during a collapsing evacuation and a losing war. After Germany's defeat, many Germans were reluctant to present themselves publicly as victims while the scale of Nazi crimes was being exposed. In Soviet-controlled East Germany, there was little incentive to build public memory around thousands of Germans killed by a Soviet submarine. The story did survive. Survivors wrote about it, books were published. A German film dramatized the sinking. Decades later, writers returned to it again. So Wilhelm Gustloff was never literally erased, but it never became part of worldwide popular memory in the way Titanic did. There was no single moment when the world decided to forget the Gustloff. Instead, the disaster was buried beneath a much larger history: a collapsing dictatorship, a refugee crisis, a military evacuation, a submarine attack, thousands of civilians, military passengers, the crimes of Nazi Germany, the destruction suffered by the Soviet Union, and a war so enormous that even the deaths of more than 9,000 people aboard one ship could become just one tragedy among countless others. And that may be the most disturbing part of the Wilhelm Gustloff story. Not simply that so many people died, but that human memory has limits. Titanic became a symbol recognized almost everywhere. Wilhelm Gustloff became something very different, a reminder that the scale of a tragedy does not guarantee that history will remember it. More than 9,000 people may have died in a single night, and for much of the world, even the name of their ship nearly disappeared with them.